You are now watching history's greatest enigmas. Stick around for riddles and mysteries as we journey through time together.
In the deep winter of 1922, a riddle was written in the snows of Bavaria. It was a story told not in words, but in silence and shadows. It began with footprints, a single set of tracks leading out of the dense forest toward a lonely farmstead. But there were no tracks leading away. The prints stop at the house, as if a ghost vanished into the walls. This was the first sign, the first whisper of a presence that should not have been there. The family noticed the tracks. They searched the fields and the rooms, found no one. The footprints were a question mark left in the pristine white landscape. The riddle continued inside the house. A strange sound, a creak from the attic late at night. The family would look up from their simple supper. Forks paused. Was it just old wood settling in the bitter cold, or something else? Footsteps, faint and muffled, echoed from the rafters. Andreas Gruber climbed the ladder to the dusty loft, lantern throwing long shadows. He found nothing. Old tools, stored hay, the quiet dust of years. The sounds returned, a soft shuffling in the darkness. Consider this puzzle, a chilling enigma from a time long past. I lived in the attic for months. I watched the family every day. I listened to their conversations. I learned their routines. I breathed the air of their home. I ate their food when they were asleep. Then, one cold evening, I killed them all with a mattock. I murdered every man. I murdered every woman. I murdered every child. No one saw me come. No one saw me go. What was I? This question has haunted investigators for a century. This story is not fiction. It is the true unsolved Hinterkaifeck case. We will peel back the layers, step by step. We will walk the snowy path to the isolated farmstead. We will listen for the whispers in the attic. We will stand in the barn where the horror began. We will examine the evidence. We will examine the strange clues. We will confront the unsettling fact that after the slaughter, the killer did not flee. They stayed. The stage for this tragedy was a place that felt cut off from the rest of the world. The farm was known to locals as Hinterkaifeck. The name itself suggested isolation, meaning something like behind the hollow. It was not even an official town name, but a local nickname for the remote property, situated roughly a kilometre from the nearest hamlet of Kaifeck. The farmstead was a cluster of buildings. The main house, a large barn, a few sheds, all huddled together against the harsh Bavarian winds. Thick, dark forests pressed in on all sides, their tall pines standing like silent, watchful sentinels. In the winter, snow would fall for days, burying the landscape, a muffling blanket of white that swallowed all sound. Life at Hinterkaifeck was hard and relentless, governed by the seasons and the demands of the land. The Gruber family who lived there were known as quiet, somewhat withdrawn people. Andreas Gruber, a man in his 60s, stern and difficult. His wife, Kazilia, in her 70s. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel. 7-year-old Kazilia, 2-year-old Joseph. The family kept to themselves, and dark rumors often swirled around them in the nearby villages. The family dynamic was complex and shrouded in local gossip, adding another layer of shadow. The farm was not just a home, it was a self-contained world. They worked their own land, they tended their own animals, they relied on themselves for nearly everything. This self-sufficiency also meant deep isolation. Their nearest neighbors were a long walk away and visitors were infrequent. This seclusion is a critical piece of the puzzle. It meant the family was on their own in the weeks before the murders. No one close enough to hear a scream in the night. No one to notice a strange light in a window. No one to offer help. The very isolation that defined their lives would ultimately seal their fate. It is into this lonely world that our story descends. Imagine the biting cold of late March 1922, smoke curling from the farmhouse chimney, a fragile sign of life in a vast, empty landscape. It is here that something began to go terribly wrong. The family was not entirely alone, though they did not know it. Something was watching them. Something was living alongside them. A parasitic presence hidden just out of sight. Before the violence erupted, there were warnings. Footprints in the snow, objects found moved or missing, animals restless in the stable. These hints pointed to a monster lurking in the shadows, already inside the gates, patiently waiting to strike. The night of Friday, March 31st, 1922, descended upon Hinterkaifeck with a bitter, bone-deep cold. A fragile layer of snow still clung to the fields, and the air was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Inside the farmhouse, the family was settling in for the evening. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had arrived only hours earlier, likely feeling the awkwardness of a stranger in a new home. A home already saturated with a quiet, unspoken dread. The children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, would have been readied for bed. For a fleeting moment, it might have seemed like any other night on the isolated farmstead. But in the shadows, the unseen monster that had been living in their attic was finally ready to act. The long, patient watch was over. The catalyst for the horror appears to have been a deliberate and cunning act of deception. Investigators later theorized that the killer used a sound to draw the family members out of the relative safety of the house and into the vast, dark expanse of the barn. Perhaps it was the sound of a distressed cow, or maybe it was a deliberate clang, a metallic sound mimicking a piece of farm equipment falling or breaking. Whatever the noise was, it was convincing enough to stir Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and even young Cecilia. They left the warmth of the home and crossed the cold, dark courtyard. We can imagine the scene. The family, bundled against the cold, carrying a single flickering lantern. Their breath would have plumed in the frigid air, their footsteps crunching softly on the frozen ground. The barn door would have creaked open, revealing a cavern of shadows broken only by the small pool of light from their lamp. The familiar smells of hay, livestock, and damp earth would have filled their senses. They were walking into the heart of their domain, a place of work and sustenance, completely unaware that it had been transformed into a meticulously prepared killing floor. The killer, hidden in the blackness, watched them enter, a spider waiting for the flies to walk into its web. Once inside the barn, the family began to investigate the source of the disturbance. It was in this moment of vulnerability, as their attention was focused on the animals, that the killer struck. Emerging from the absolute darkness of a corner or dropping from the hayloft above, the attacker moved with silent, brutal efficiency. The weapon of choice was a mattock, a heavy farming tool, with a pick on one side and an adze on the other. It was a familiar object from their own tool shed, now turned against them with savage intent. The first victim was likely Andreas Gruber, as the patriarch and the strongest man in the family. Eliminating him first would have been a tactical necessity. The first blow would have been swift and shocking, a crushing impact to the head delivered with terrifying force. He would have fallen without a chance to fight back, his lantern perhaps clattering to the floor and extinguishing, plunging the scene into near total darkness. In the ensuing chaos and darkness, the killer turned on the women. Cecilia, Andreas's elderly wife, and their daughter Victoria were the next to be attacked. The blows from the mattock were relentless and devastating, aimed at their heads with the same brutal precision. The killer was operating in a frenzy of controlled violence, moving from one victim to the next with chilling speed and purpose, leaving no one standing. The final victim in this initial onslaught was the eldest child, 7-year-old Cecilia. She may have witnessed the horrific murder of her mother, grandmother, and grandfather before the killer turned on her. The pathologist's report would later suggest the child had survived for several hours after the attack, tearing out clumps of her own hair in her agony and terror before she finally succumbed to her injuries. This detail is perhaps the most heart-wrenching of all. The barn, once a place of labor and life, had become a tomb, filled with the bodies of 4 members of the Gruber family. The killer's work was only half finished. 2 victims remained inside the house: Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, and Josef, the 2-year-old toddler. The killer entered her room. The attack was swift and brutal, killing her in her own bed. She was simply there, another living person on the farm, and so had to be eliminated. The next target was Victoria's bedroom, where her 2-year-old son, Joseph, was sleeping. The presence of the killer standing over the sleeping toddler is pure, unadulterated horror. The killer raised the mattock one last time and brought it down on the sleeping child, killing him instantly in his cot. The act is almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. The silence that followed was absolute. The slaughter was complete. The brutal massacre at Hinterkaifeck on the night of Friday, March 31st, was not the end of the horror. It was the beginning of a new, deeply unsettling chapter. After methodically slaughtering 6 people, the killer did not flee into the night. Instead, the murderer stayed. For several days, this phantom figure became the sole living master of the farm. They walked the same floors. They used their belongings. They tended to the daily chores. The crime scene became a temporary home, a macabre domestic performance. The killer was no longer just a monster hiding in the attic. They had become a phantom farmer. Imagine the psychology required. To live and sleep in a house with bodies cooling in beds and in the nearby barn would demand a level of detachment beyond comprehension. The killer moved from room to room, the silence broken only by footsteps and the creaking of the old house. The presence of the dead did not seem to disturb this individual. The house was not a tomb to be fled from, but a conquered vessel to be commanded. They knew where the food was stored. They knew how the wood-burning stove operated. They knew where the family slept. This was not an outsider fumbling around in an unfamiliar environment. This was someone who had already made the house their own, long before the murders. The act of killing the family was simply the final step in removing the previous tenants. Over the weekend that followed, people reported seeing smoke rise steadily from the farmhouse chimney. In the cold Bavarian spring, a smoking chimney meant someone was home. It was the universal sign of a living household, and it became the killer's most effective misdirection. While the Grubers and their maid lay cold and still, the killer calmly stoked the kitchen fire to create an illusion of normalcy. The column of smoke was a lie sent into the sky. The fire also served a practical purpose. They were living in the house, and the nights were cold. Warmth, cooking. Evidence of recently eaten meals confirms they were sustaining themselves. The image of the murderer at the warm stove, eating a meal they'd prepared while the victims lay rooms away, is one of the most chilling in the case. One of the most perplexing clues discovered by investigators was the condition of the farm animals. When the bodies were finally discovered, the animals were found to be in perfect health. The cows had been milked and all the animals had been recently fed and given water. The phantom of Hinterkaifeck was not just a murderer, they were also a caretaker. Furthermore, the dog in the barn was found unharmed. A farm dog would typically bark furiously at an intruder. This has led to 2 chilling possibilities. Either the dog knew the killer and was therefore not threatened by their presence, or the killer had a way with animals that allowed them to approach and silence the dog without violence. Sometime between Sunday night and Monday morning, the killer's strange and terrifying occupation of Hinterkaifeck came to an end. The phantom farmer simply vanished. They slipped away from the farm, leaving behind a scene of perfectly preserved horror. A tableau of death that would not be discovered for at least another day. The killer may have sensed that the window of opportunity was closing. Young Cecilia had not appeared at school. The family had been absent from church. The mail was piling up. The house, which for a few days had a single living occupant, was now truly and completely a house of the dead, waiting for the outside world to finally pull back the curtain and gaze upon the horror within. By Tuesday, April 4th, the silence from Hinterkaifeck had grown too loud to ignore. Lorenz Schlittenbauer gathered a small search party, and they approached the farm with dread. They found the doors locked and forced their way into the barn. In the dim light, they discovered Andreas Gruber. They found his wife, Cecilia. They found their daughter, Victoria. They found young Cecilia. The bodies were piled together, partially covered with hay and an old door. The victims had been brutally bludgeoned to death. Their shock deepened when they moved to the main house. In the maid's chamber, they found Maria Baumgartner. In Victoria's bedroom, they found 2-year-old Joseph. The entire household had been annihilated. News spread, shockwaves through the Bavarian community and across Germany. The Munich police department was called in. The investigation was immediately hampered. The crime scene had been compromised from the very beginning. Scores of locals contaminated what was left of the crime scene. The initial autopsy, conducted on site, was rudimentary by today's standards. He determined the cause of death for all 6 victims: massive blunt force trauma to the head. The heads of the victims were removed and sent to Munich for further examination by clairvoyants, a bizarre and desperate measure highlighting the investigators' struggle. The police interviewed over 100 suspects. Their efforts were frustrated by local gossip, personal grudges, and the dark secrets surrounding the Gruber family. Robbery was ruled out. A large sum of money was found untouched in the house. Ultimately, the initial investigation failed to produce a single arrest. Police were left with baffling clues. These elements pointed to a killer intimately familiar with the farm and also a ghost-like stranger. One of the earliest and most enduring theories centered on Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who organized the search party. He had been in an affair with Victoria Gabriel. He was widely believed to be the biological father of her son, Joseph. Shortly before the murders, Victoria had been suing him for financial support, creating significant tension and a clear motive. Supporting this theory is Schlittenbauer's strange behavior at the crime scene. Was he in shock, or deliberately muddying the waters to conceal his own involvement? But there are major problems with the theory. It's hard to reconcile a respected community member with the sheer brutality of the murders. The overkill seems disproportionate to avoiding child support. So was he a grieving man who stumbled on a horror or a cold-blooded killer covering his tracks? Another compelling theory posits that the killer was Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who was thought to have been killed in the trenches. While he was officially reported dead, his body was never recovered. This sliver of uncertainty gave rise to a chilling possibility. What if Karl Gabriel had survived the war? He would have returned to find his wife had been in an incestuous relationship with her own father and had given birth to a child. Such a discovery could have triggered a jealous, vengeful rage. This theory elegantly explains several of the case's most bizarre elements. However, there is absolutely no concrete evidence that he survived the war. The Karl Gabriel theory ultimately feels more like a piece of dark folklore than a plausible explanation, leaving the identity of the man with the mattock still lost in the fog of history. At the beginning of our journey, which we posed a riddle, I lived in the attic for months, watched the family, ate their food, and then killed them all. What was I? The answer, as dramatic and unsettling as the crime itself, is not a name. The answer to the riddle is, quite simply, the unknown killer of Hinterkaifeck, a spectre of flesh and blood, a human monster, who managed to be both intimately present and utterly invisible. A void, a black hole in the historical record where a name and a face should be. This killer was a master of shadow. They were a patient observer. They knew when to hide and when to act. They understood that tending to the animals and keeping smoke rising from the chimney would create a powerful illusion of normalcy. The riddle's answer is a reflection of our own deepest fears, that the greatest monsters are not those from stories, but the unseen ones who live just out of sight in the attics of our own world. And so, we turn the final question over to you. Who do you think was hiding in the attic? Was it the vengeful neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer? Was it the ghost of a husband, Karl Gabriel? Or was it someone else entirely, a stranger, a madman? Why did they kill the entire family, and why did they stay? The shadows of Hinterkaifeck are long, and they hide their secrets well. The truth is likely buried forever. The enigma is now yours to ponder. Look into the darkness of this case and decide for yourself what you see. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's darkest enigmas, smash that like button. Leave your theory in the comments below. The best ones get pinned. And subscribe to history's greatest enigmas for more unsolved historical mysteries and riddles every single week. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode.
We conclude our journey into the past for now. Make sure to like and subscribe to get notified for history's greatest enigmas.